I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's May 20th, and we have a lot to talk about. At the end of 2022, an international panel of MS experts published a paper calling for a new framework to describe MS. The by now very familiar MS course descriptors, relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, and primary progressive, were first introduced in 1996. And with all that science had learned about MS since then, experts believe that all of that accumulated knowledge could lead to a more precise and nuanced way to describe the complexities of multiple sclerosis. And the more precisely you can describe a disease, the better your chances are for developing more targeted, more effective treatments. If you'd like to give yourself a quick refresher on that paper, I'll invite you to listen to my interview with the paper's lead author, Professor Tanya Kuhlman, in episode 279 of Real Talk MS. Then I'll recommend you listen to episode 280 of the podcast, when the now president and CEO of the National MS Society, Dr. Tim Cutsey, explained how a new framework that took 3 decades of scientific advances into account would benefit people living with MS. And you'll find links to both of those episodes in today's show notes. Following the publication of that paper, the International Advisory Committee for Clinical Trials in Multiple Sclerosis formed a working group to further investigate and develop this idea of a new way to describe, to talk about MS. A way that would not only rely on how an individual could be evaluated in the clinic, but a framework that would also define MS and more fully explain MS in terms of the biological mechanisms that were taking place in that individual's central nervous system. Over the past couple of years, we've talked about this work, and in the interest of full disclosure, I've reminded you that I'm actually a member of this working group. And that brings us to this past week, when the National Multiple Sclerosis Society and the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis co-hosted a meeting in Dublin, Ireland, to dive deeper into what a new framework for describing MS might look like. There's still a tremendous amount of work to be done here. But considering that whatever language that's adopted in the future is going to affect every person living with MS, I want to keep you fully informed on this important work. So I'm devoting this entire episode of the podcast to sharing 3 conversations I had with 3 attendees at this meeting in Dublin. And as you listen to these conversations, I think you'll hear 3 slightly different perspectives, but you'll also hear some of the broad concepts and ideas around which there was a high level of agreement at our meeting. First, you'll hear from Dr. Bruce Bebo, the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research. Then you'll hear from Dr. Daniel Ontaneda, a neurologist specializing in multiple sclerosis at the Cleveland Clinic. And finally, you'll hear from Kathy Smith, who's lived with MS for the past 20 years. So in a moment, we'll hear my conversation with Dr. Bruce Bebo. It's always a treat for me to come to a research conference or a meeting and see my friend in the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo. Here we are again, Bruce.
We are, and instead of being outside in the sunny steps, we're in a dark conference room in Dublin, Ireland.
Can't always pick your spots, but here we are. The title of this workshop is Moving Towards a Biologically Based Description of the MS Disease Course. Why is that an important subject?
Well, I think it represents that we're at an inflection point in our understanding of MS, that we are evolving from only understanding how MS presents and appears clinically in an individual to understanding some of the underlying biology that's driving the clinical presentation of MS. And that better understanding of the underlying biology is really important because if we can get to a more biological description of MS, we can get to this goal of more precision therapy, right? If I know what biological mechanism is driving your clinical presentation of disease, I can better deploy a disease-modifying therapy that would address that underlying biology, and a person would have better outcomes.
Well, I want to get back to just about everything you just said. So let's start with asking you your thoughts on the limitations of the existing MS course descriptors when it comes to advancing research or improving patient outcomes.
It's trying to put people into categories, neat categories that that a lot of people don't fit into. So I think we all are aware, everyone at this meeting is aware that everybody's journey with MS is different, and it can, MS manifest in a lot of different ways. And the descriptors we have aren't giving us, or aren't categorizing people in a way that's helpful. They're helpful, but they're not optimal for informing treatments, both pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments. And I think that the tension is we understand a lot more about the underlying biology of MS than we did in 2017 when the last version of the disease descriptors was published. But we might not be quite close enough to completely describe the disease in biological terms. And I think that's the tension that we're feeling at this meeting, is that we've come really a long way since 2017. And I think there's a little difference of opinion right now, whether we've come as far enough in the biological understanding to really describe the disease in terms of the biology underlying the clinical presentation. That's the arguments I think we're having this week in the conference room.
And I guess the hope is that a framework that can be developed now that can evolve as some of those missing pieces get identified along the way.
Yeah. And so I think that's where we're landing, right? So this is all really fresh. I mean, we just walked out of the room now, and I think I felt that there was this consensus for a framework that's based in our current understanding of both the clinical and the biological underpinnings of the disease that will set us up for the future. It'll create a framework that we can fill in with, as the biological understanding of the underpinnings of different aspects of disease become more clear, that we can fill in this framework. My feeling from the meeting the last couple of days is that the community feels like we're ready to create this framework, even if all the details of it aren't quite there yet.
How high of a priority is the development and adoption of more refined course descriptors within the Society's current research agenda?
Yeah, I think this is a very high priority because this can have a tremendous impacts on people's quality of life. It's also, it fits in with the recent work this committee and the Society has supported in the update of the diagnostic criteria. These diagnostic criteria and disease descriptor work go hand in hand, as the new diagnostic criteria have allowed us, or will allow us, to diagnose MS earlier and more accurately. And then the disease descriptors will help us understand the underlying biology driving the clinical presentation of MS, and customize our treatments to that underlying biology. And in both cases, we will get people on a disease-modifying therapy or other therapy that best suits the underlying biology. We get them on it earlier and get them on a treatment that addresses the underlying cause of their MS earlier, and have better outcomes for everyone living with MS. So it's incredibly high priority.
Well, before people can be treated with those therapies, some of those therapies need to be developed. So how could more precise course descriptors potentially accelerate the development of more targeted and effective therapies for different subgroups of people with MS?
Yeah, really good question, John. So I think it's to be able to select people for trials of disease-modifying therapies that actually have the underlying biology that therapy is proposed to address will help reduce the size of trials, reduce the expense of trials, encourage companies to explore more disease-modifying therapies, because the risk of trials the risk is reduced because you're selecting people to participate that are biased towards responding to the therapy that you're developing. And I don't mean bias in a negative sense. I mean bias in that we have a better understanding of the biology driving that group, that those people's disease. And we know that this, let's say, drug or treatment would address that underlying biology. It should get us to those answers quicker. And again, getting us to this goal of precision medicine, of finding the therapy that works best for an individual person. So I think having a better grasp of the diagnostic criteria and having more accurate disease descriptors that account for the underlying biology will accelerate the development of new therapies for all forms of MS.
Well, we've been talking about some of those benefits. What do you see as the key challenges to moving beyond the current classification system?
As I mentioned, I think we've learned a lot about the underlying biology driving different forms of MS, but there's still large gaps in our knowledge of what is driving some of the underlying biology. So I think one gap is being able to measure MS biologically. So we can measure MS clinically. People can take a neurologic exam. You go to your neurologist. They can, measure your walking speed and different clinical aspects of it. In some ways, we can use MRI imaging to measure evolution of lesions in the nervous system. MRI is imperfect. So I think there's certainly a opportunity to continue to invest in imaging and other kinds of technology that can measure what's happening inside of the nervous system. Biomarkers or fluid biomarkers that can measure damage to the nervous system have evolved, and we have at least one biomarker I think will be really valuable for us in the next few years. But I think that continues to be a gap in being able to measure some of this biological activity. And frankly, there's still some gaps in our understanding of what's driving different forms of MS, particularly the progressive aspects of MS. There are a lot of proposed pathways that could be driving progression in people. I think that's where some of our biggest gaps in understanding and knowledge are, as what is driving progression in individual person. And we have very few options to address that biology right now. So I think it's biggest opportunity, is understanding the underlying biology of progression, and then the development of disease-modifying therapies that address that underlying biology. And frankly, measuring progression is another big area that we have to get better at.
So what message would the National MS Society like to convey to researchers, clinicians, and people living with MS about the importance of evolving our understanding and classification of this very complex disease?
So I think my first message is that we've learned so much about MS in the last decade that we are at this inflection point where we feel compelled to change the disease descriptors because of this enhanced understanding of what's driving MS. It's not perfect. It's not fully evolved or understood yet, but the current framework has a lot of challenges, and our understanding of what's driving MS has changed so much. So there's a message of hope, John, is what I want to send, is that this need to update the disease descriptors is because we've made so much progress, both in the understanding of what's driving MS and the treatment of MS, that it's starting not to make sense anymore. And so I think that's one message. The second one is there are a lot of implications for changing the disease descriptors, both for clinical trials, for treatment, and of course for people living with MS. To completely change the way you're going to describe the disease has to be done thoughtfully and thinking it with all the downstream possible consequences, and both known and unknown and unintended consequences. So I think there's also a tension. There's feeling that we need to move with urgency because the current disease descriptors aren't working really well for us, but we need to be cautious because there are lots of implications that, some of which we can anticipate and some of which we can't. So we have to really be thoughtful at the same time as moving with urgency. So that's kind of the tension that, I'm certainly feeling, and I think that everyone in the room this week's been feeling.
Well, I think it would be an understatement to say this is going to be a heavy lift. This is a long-term project. It's not quite like flipping a light switch. There are so many moving parts to this. It's not just, for instance, the people in the conference room. It goes so far beyond that in terms of the patient community and the rest of the research community. And oh my goodness, the regulators, the insurance companies, everyone who is kind of plugged into the multiple sclerosis ecosystem today is going to be affected by this, aren't they?
Yeah, that's correct. So one, I want to compliment you, John, with your very eloquent presentation at the meeting just, an hour ago to represent the person affected by MS perspective, which it has to be a gigantic consideration in any change we're going to make. And on that topic, I don't think any change to the disease descriptors is going to happen right away. There's a discussion this week of possibly a framework. There's a lot of details that need to be worked out. There will need to be a lot of preparation, both in the professional community and in the patient community for new disease descriptor sort of framework. So this isn't happening tomorrow. I don't have a specific timeline for this, but there will be a long runway and a lot of preparation before we would roll out any sort of change to, as you mentioned, there's a lot of stakeholders. There are patients and family members, and there are healthcare providers, and there are regulators, and there are drug development companies, and so many different implications for making this change that, again, I think there's a urgency to do it because the current disease descriptors have a lot of flaws, but we need to be very careful, intentional, and anticipate as many of the downstream consequences as we possibly can. So it's not happening this week. I don't have a precise timeline, but it's going to take some time to get there.
Well, as they say, journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, right?
Correct. Yeah. And we took a couple of steps this week, I would say.
We did. Dr. Bruce Bebo, I look forward to the next time we bump into each other.
Thanks, John. Always good to be with you.
After speaking with Bruce, I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Daniel Ontaneda. In a moment, we'll hear my conversation with Dr. Ontaneda. I'm talking with Dr. Daniel Ontaneda, a neurologist specializing in MS at the Cleveland Clinic. Dr. Ontaneda, in your experience, what are the biggest limitations of the current multiple sclerosis course descriptors?
Thanks so much, John, for the question. I think what happens to us commonly in clinic when seeing people with MS, and I think what happens frequently to people with MS, is that our current descriptors of the disease fall short in capturing everything that MS is. I think clear examples of this is, we call multiple sclerosis relapsing remitting, which suggests that there are true remissions, when I think a lot of people who are living with MS do experience what one could consider a remission, but others don't. And, it's not uncommon for us to see patients who don't have attacks, don't have new MRI lesions, but I think calling them in true remission when they have ongoing symptoms, and many times worsening of symptoms over time, is a little bit unfair. I think on the other side of things, we think about the term progressive MS, which I think carries a lot of baggage with it, both for neurologists and for people with MS. And I think rather than this being a single state that people enter and can never leave, I think it's much more biological, it's much more in flux, and I think we have to think about it in a much more dynamic way.
From a communication standpoint, do you find that the current course descriptors are clear enough? Are they helpful for patients who are trying to understand their own condition and prognosis?
So I think the current disease descriptors, I think, are somewhat founded in descriptions of how neurologists have viewed people with MS. And I think the big problem with them is that they categorize people in very distinct groups, where there's a black and white cutoff from relapsing remitting to secondary progressive MS, when in reality, that's not the case. I think the reality is that MS is a spectrum. It presents differently in every single person with MS. the clinical course is slightly different in every person with MS. And I think when we're thinking about modern concepts of disease course, I think we're going to have to think about it much more widely. Describe different processes, describe different lived experiences, describe different, perhaps even biomarker findings, to kind of have a better way of understanding MS as a whole. I think that the descriptors were useful at some point, especially for clinical trials and for us to get people into studies that we thought, shared some common features. But I think we now understand the disease so much better. I think we're able to give people a voice with the disease in a dimension that we previously didn't have. And I think our course descriptors have to evolve to match up to our new understandings.
In what ways could better course descriptors directly benefit someone with MS?
Yeah, I think there's multiple ways where I think we can benefit. I think on the one end, I think for people with MS, understanding that, what we call their current state of MS is a true reflection of what they're feeling. I think that's the first thing, because I think people need validation of, whatever we call this, it is actually a reflection of what I'm feeling. So I think that's the one thing. I think the second thing, and perhaps important thing, is that as we are expanding how we treat MS and what are the different facets of MS that we can treat, I think people will want to say, what are the aspects of MS that I can treat? Right now, we've got essentially two main buckets of MS. And the reality is that there's probably many different mechanisms, and you probably want treatment for each one of those mechanisms. And therefore, for a person with MS to say, to reduce their MS to, perhaps a bidimensionality, I think is difficult. And I think going forward, what we can perhaps think about is a day where we can classify MS based on multiple features, and that perhaps we'll have tools for every single one of those features so that we can treat that.
Well, I have to ask you, in an ideal scenario then, which characteristics or which dimensions would a more comprehensive set of course descriptors, what might they encompass?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that we can think about. On the one end, I think that thinking about multiple sclerosis occurring in a dichotomy, I think we know now that that's not correct. MS doesn't occur in a relapsing, remitting, and secondary progressive dichotomy. I think what it's going to look like is going to look like more, what features of relapses do you have throughout your disease course, and what perhaps features of worsening do you have throughout your disease course, and how can those change over time? I think that's the one thing, just based on the clinical. I think on the second, I think we need to think about how do we better capture the patient's voice in their understanding of their disease process. I can't tell you how many times we see patients in clinic where we say, your MRI is stable, your neurological exam is stable, you haven't had attacks. Neurologists call that stability. And I think that is far from the truth for a large proportion of people with MS. So I think that's the second advantage. Then I think the third thing that we want to think about is, what can we interrogate directly from patients and people with MS? What can we interrogate from MRIs? What can we interrogate from blood samples that allow us to better define the different aspects of MS?
I'm wondering, we've been talking primarily about disease management. Could better descriptors also lead to more tailored rehabilitation strategies and symptom management strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. When I talk about treatment management, I think don't only think about medications. We're talking about strategies on how to improve the quality of life with people with MS, and that encompasses, everything from a medication to rehabilitation to psychology to what is their environment like in terms of exposures, in terms of socioeconomic factors, comorbidities. So I think all of these are potential areas that we can target. So I think in general, and you probably detect a little bit of a theme here, is that, we're thinking about MS in a much broader sense. We're looking at it from different angles, different treatment angles, different description angles. And, I think it makes the problem a little complex, and difficult for us. But at the same time, I think, if we put our heads together with different stakeholders, with people with MS, we can get a much fuller understanding of what multiple sclerosis is.
So we're talking about not only a more personalized approach to treatment as a result of more accurate or more specific course descriptors, but also perhaps a more holistic approach to treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think when you're better able to name the different processes that are there, the better you are at addressing them. So I think key in the concepts of this is that we want to describe the entirety of what MS means, because based on that, we'll be much more effective at ensuring that treatment is better across all aspects.
Well, Dr. Daniel Ontaneda, I want to thank you so much for taking a few minutes from the conference to talk with me today.
My pleasure, John. Thank you so much as always.
Finally, I had a chance to talk with Kathy Smith, a friend whom I've known for several years. In a moment, we'll hear that conversation. Kathy Smith has lived with MS for 20 years, and this 3-day workshop began with Kathy sharing her perspective on the current course descriptors. You really kicked off this workshop by sharing your thoughts on the current MS course descriptors. How was that experience for you?
I found it a little intimidating to begin with, although I have been part of these groups before. But always telling your personal story is a little bit emotional and takes you back. Sometimes if you're talking about something that happened to you 20 years ago, you have those memories are vivid and come back to you in ways that you did not quite expect would come back to you.
You know what, Kathy? I had that exact same experience today when I was presenting. Exactly. Yeah. So I get it. When you were first diagnosed, how helpful were the terms relapsing, remitting, secondary progressive, or primary progressive in understanding what your MS might be like?
So at the time, I was diagnosed with relapsing, remitting MS. And at the time, I thought that it was helpful. Looking back, I'm not sure how helpful it was. And to explain that, so the words relapsing, remitting made me think that I was going to have this very episodic disease course. I'd experienced an initial event and then a period of recovery and then another relapse. And I thought, this is what my life is going to be like. I'm going to have these acute attacks that kind of put me down, debilitate me for a week until I get a bunch of steroids on board. And then I'm going to recover or mostly recover. And then it's going to happen again. I don't know, in a year, in 2 years, in whatever. But that's really not how it played out in that. So after those 2 initial relapses, I had 1 more relapse in the next 5 years, and I haven't had a relapse since. So that description doesn't really mean much to me anymore. It's not accurate to what my disease is now.
If there were more detailed or nuanced ways to describe the MS disease course, are there any aspects of your experience that you would want to see better captured?
So I think one of the big things for me to include would be a description of functionality, a description that would include walking, cognition, fatigue, other kinds of symptoms that come and go with MS that are not at all captured in the course descriptors.
Would a more nuanced understanding of your disease course influence any of your decisions about treatment or potential lifestyle adjustments?
So, John, it's kind of interesting because when I go to see my neurologist, we have that nuanced conversation. We talk about, what's on my MRI this year. We talk about, she'll test my walking. She'll do a neurological exam. She'll ask me about, am I still doing the kind of exercise that I want to do, and how, do I need any physical therapy? What kind of diet am I eating? And I can ask all kinds of questions. So the discussion is very multidimensional, I suppose, or comprehensive for a very multidimensional disease.
I think as this meeting has progressed, people have sort of rallied around the ideas that we can do a better job today of explaining MS, because in the last 30 years, since the course descriptors that we use today were first brought into being, science has progressed. We've learned a lot. So we want to apply that knowledge, right? But I'm curious, do you see any downside, or you have any concerns about having more complex or detailed ways of describing MS?
So yes, I think that from a patient perspective, there are concerns, because many of us who've had this disease for a long time, it kind of has come along with us. And so changing that might be it will require some time and some really good communication, education to help people understand what would be a new course descriptor. And would I be able to still get the drug if there was a new course descriptor? I think that there's a lot to think about, as we would think about new course descriptors. There's a patient perspective, but then there's a clinician and research perspective. Industry will have a view on this. The regulators will have a view. The insurance companies will have a view, and bringing everybody along will be so important.
So imagine for a moment a future where MS is described in a much more personalized way. What would be the biggest positive impact of this for people who are living with MS?
So I think that people with MS would then have a much better understanding of, here's where I am at this moment. I have MS, and I have these, following characteristics of my disease. And hopefully because of that, I would know more about what is my path, what is my trajectory for disease from here.
I think a lot of those interest holders that you just mentioned, industry and researchers and clinicians and patients, I think we're going to see representatives from all those groups working on this. It's a long-term project, right? We're not going to flip the switch on Monday. What advice would you give that group? A group that I imagine you're even going to be a part of. So what advice would you give that group moving forward?
We must step forward. The current descriptors don't accurately describe MS today. They worked well 30 years ago, but they don't really work today. And let's get very clear about how we want to describe it now. We have to be crystal clear about where it is we're trying to go. And then there will be lots of work to fill in on a framework and to bring all the stakeholders together to implement and bring this into the common language.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Kathy, full disclosure for our listeners, you and I have been sitting at meetings together for a long time now, all kinds of different meetings. And I just want to say, for me, the best part of coming to a meeting like this is knowing I'm going to see you.
Well, and I couldn't have said it better. I agree with that. Oh, thank you, John.
The work involved in developing a new framework, new course descriptors to describe MS is continuing. And you can be sure we'll be talking about it, as that work is going to include capturing the voices of people affected by MS in the development of this new framework. But that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/403. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. From Dublin, Ireland, I'm John Strom. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.